what do we think about Nick Saban? Nick Saban is the greatest college football coach of all time. And this is the stat that, to me, epitomizes Nick Saban's greatness. And just follow me here. 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022. I believe that is 14 straight years. It took me that long to say Nick Saban's team at some point in each of those seasons has been ranked number one in the country. That is a record that I don't believe will ever be equaled in the lifetime of anyone watching or listening to this program or anyone alive today. I don't think that anybody will have as dominant of a role as Nick Saban did when it comes to his tenure as Alabama Crimson Tide coach. I also believe that many people, and we'll get into this in a moment, are overrating the Alabama job based on how well Nick Saban did there. The coach matters way more than the program once you're in the top 15 or top 20. I have said for years that if Nick Saban had stayed at LSU, if he had been at Georgia, if he had been at Florida, if he had been at Tennessee, if he had been at any of the top 5 or 6 jobs in the SEC, starting in 2007 when he took over at Alabama, I think that Nick Saban would have had the same level of success at those places. I think he would have had the same success at Ohio State probably. But in the SEC, where he recruited 10 number one overall classes according to the Rivals recruiting rankings, I believe it's 44 first-round draft picks. He had more first-round draft picks than he did losses in his entire tenure at Alabama. Another good stat for you, every player who stayed 4 years with Nick Saban won at least one national championship. And to me, the greatness of Saban is personified by the fact that he changed the entire way he coached. If you remember those first couple of title teams, they were very defense first, run the football, workmanlike game manager style quarterbacks. And then he turned into a absolute throw the ball all over the field, let your offense make plays, I can win a game 50-40 if I need to style coach. That to me was the greatness of Nick Saban, that he was able to evolve as the pace and play of the game around him evolved. And so I think he is unquestionably the greatest college football coach of all time. Now, there's a lot of questions about what's going to be the move that Alabama makes now. And I think that in and of itself is a very fascinating question. Dan Lanning, and by the way, I can barely keep up, so I'm sure some of you are chasing this as well. So it's possible the news is breaking while I am talking about all these subjects. I would just ask the team back home in our studios if there is some major news story that breaks about Alabama or the Patriots or anything else, and I'll get to Bill Belichick in a moment. Let me know during the course of the show, because who knows what's going to happen. Dan Lanning, who was rumored to be one of the top candidates, has chosen not to leave Oregon. To me, there are a lot of names out there that could be worthy of contemplating. When this initial decision was made, the 3 or 4 names that came to mind, I tweeted about it. Lane Kiffin, Dabo Swinney, obviously, who played at Alabama, now the Clemson head coach, and Dan Lanning were the guys that immediately came to mind for me. I think you could add Kalen DeBoer. Mike Norvell seems to be in the mix as well, Florida State's coach. Regardless of who Alabama hires, it's likely there's going to be a big drop-off. And that's why I was saying the coach matters more than the program. Nobody is anywhere near the caliber of Nick Saban. The closest modern-day Nick Saban now is certainly Kirby Smart at Georgia. But when you look at this right now, this is a stat for you that a lot of people are not going to share. From 1980 until 2009, when Nick Saban won his first national championship at Alabama, Alabama won 1 national title in 1992. That was the end of Bear Bryant's tenure and the attempt to replace Bear Bryant. 30 years almost, Alabama won one national title. The Tide program in general for those 30 years was often very mediocre. And so what Nick Saban has done at Alabama is incredible, but I think it's about Nick Saban. I don't think it's about Alabama. And the standard that Nick Saban set is so high that whoever walks in to follow him is going to have incredible shoes to fill. And let me just give you a little bit of an example of my own life. I had a really good morning sports talk radio show. Fox Sports Radio nationwide. Some of you listened. We led into Dan Patrick, and then from Dan Patrick, it went into Colin Cowherd. We were the most successful Fox Sports Radio morning show that they've ever had. Added a lot of affiliates. ESPN went through like 4 or 5 different morning show competitors against us. I could have stayed in that job, and I could have done that job probably for the rest of my career. That's how successful it was. Dan Patrick, Colin Cowherd, they've been doing sports talk radio for a long time. I could have done a sports talk radio show nationwide for the next 20 years, 30 years if I wanted to. They came to me and they said, hey, would you be interested in replacing Rush Limbaugh? And my initial thought was the sports analogy. Usually you don't want to be the guy who replaces the guy. You want to be the guy who comes after Ron Zook. Ron Zook memorably took over for Steve Spurrier, fell flat on his face. From Ron Zook, Florida went and they hired Urban Meyer. Boom, they had incredible success under Urban Meyer. And so there's a lot of talk out there about how you decide whether to take a job or not, especially when you follow a legend. And I talked about this yesterday on the show. To me, the 2 biggest legends in radio are Rush Limbaugh and also Howard Stern. Historically, in my lifetime, those are the 2 biggest radio stars. And so it was a challenge. Do I decide I want to do that? Do I not? Buck Sexton and I came in together. It's a little bit of a different show because you have a duo, and the show has continued to be very successful. And I said yesterday, I've signed on, and they've got me now through 2024 and through 2025. I've really enjoyed the show. I like working with Buck. It's gone very well. They're making a lot of money. Ratings are great. We got 500 affiliates. You can now stream all 3 hours either at the Clay Travis Buck Sexton Show website or through Fox Nation. You can watch all 3 hours. I don't think it's that exciting to watch me sit and wear a headset and talking to a mic, but if you're interested in having the video version of that show, you can do it. So I know a little bit something that it's like to replace a legend because Rush Limbaugh is a legend, and we stepped in, and I think we've done a pretty good job after that. So I'm not someone who would say, oh, Nick Saban was so successful, I wouldn't take that job. But I do think that the standard of success at Alabama is very unrealistic. For Nick Saban, if you won 1 championship in 5 years, that was an awful 5 years. For most of American history as it pertains to college football programs, winning a championship every 5 years would be amazing. Michigan's the winningest college football program of all time. Partly that's a function of how many games they've played. But Michigan's won 1 undisputed title since 1948. If you were born in 1949 and you were a Michigan fan, you have seen prior to Monday night 1/2 of a national title in your entire life as a Michigan fan. What is that, like 75 years? I mean, we're talking about a long time span, 1.5 titles. From 1948 to now, or 1949 to now, Michigan has won 1.5 national champions. Nick Saban won 6 at Alabama. So the level of success that he had is unlikely to be matched by anybody. And if I were betting, I would take Alabama returns to relative Alabama normalcy historically, where they're just good. And good programs can win a title every 20 years or every 30 years. And so I think that's probably the most likely direction we go. And there's going to be a big drop-off. If Mike Norvell is the hire, Mike Norvell's been successful at Florida State, but it was only a couple of years ago that everybody at Florida State wanted to fire Mike Norvell. So how sustained is the success that he would have? It's a lot easier to win at Florida State than it is at Alabama. competition's a lot harder in the SEC if he's the choice. I would go get Lane Kiffin. And I don't know what Lane Kiffin's contract is. I don't know what the buyout is at Ole Miss. I don't know the answer of any of that. But if I were making a decision right now and I were the athletic director in charge of Alabama, I would go get Lane Kiffin because I think given his success, he knows Tuscaloosa, he's well-liked, and he's been successful at Ole Miss. I don't think he would fall flat on his face. He would come in and he would win 10 games a year for the next 7 or 8 years, and that would do pretty well in a post-Saban era. That's how I think it would go. Now, you're also moving into a 12-team playoff era. Combine that with the fact that the SEC is expanding and adding Texas and Oklahoma. The paradigm of college football is shifting to a large degree. Nick Saban, greatest college football coach of all time, in my opinion. And the replacement for him is going to be hard. You could look at Kalen DeBoer at Washington. Some people are making that argument. My concern there would be he's never recruited at a really high level, and frankly, he hasn't ever been under the microscope that would be required at Alabama. I talked about this with Lane Kiffin. Even having been at USC, Lane Kiffin had no idea what taking over an SEC program like Tennessee was really going to be like. And that's the part of this why I would want somebody familiar with the culture. You find yourself under a microscope in a way, frankly, that most coaches are not. I think this is one reason Lincoln Riley went to USC. I think Lincoln Riley in Norman, Oklahoma, everybody knew everything that Lincoln Riley did every moment of the day. In L.A., Lincoln Riley is the 600th most famous person, if that, who lives in L.A. Most people don't care about him. Lane Kiffin, when he was a USC head coach, I believe lived in Manhattan Beach. Lane Kiffin was like the 300th most famous person in Manhattan Beach on any given day. There are a ton of celebrities out there. There's lots of things that people are interested in other than football. You could go to any restaurant you want. You get a table, but people aren't obsessively paying attention to you because Leonardo DiCaprio might be at the same restaurant at the same time. Like, you are just further down the flow chart of celebrity. You might not even be one of the 1,000 most famous people in Los Angeles. In Alabama, you're basically the president of the country, right? If Alabama were a standalone country, which is a funny, concept in the first place, the president of the state of Alabama is basically the Alabama football coach. And so you're going to have a lot of eyeballs on you. And so to me, I mentioned Sarkisian earlier. I don't think he would leave Texas for Alabama. That's why, to me, Lane Kiffin, typically you would leave Ole Miss for Alabama. But Lane Kiffin's got a really good team returning. Maybe just as good at Ole Miss. He may be very comfortable in Oxford, which is why this thing may end up with Mike Norvell. And Alabama fans are not going to be very comfortable with the idea, I think, of some of the guys that might be in the mix to end up their head coach. They're going to have to go down the flow chart a little bit. D'Amico Ryans, I would call him at Texas. Maybe James Franklin at Penn State ends up in the mix. I think you're going to get a head coach. I think it's unlikely you go coordinator because the job status is that high, the stature of the job. But I think this is going to be an incredibly entertaining story to follow, and also an intriguing thought experiment in how much was Nick Saban and how much was Alabama. Everyone is reporting that Kalen DeBoer is headed to Alabama to become the Crimson Tide head football coach. And I always just say everybody is reporting because things can suddenly go awry in the event that something changes. But it appears after a relatively rapid search that he is on the cusp of becoming the here are some details. Chris Lowe says Kalen DeBoer isn't going to come cheap for Alabama. He has a $12 million buyout. That is pretty significant. And I just want to make sure that nothing is changing while I am all talking to you because, as always, in the coaching search ranks, last-second change of opinions can occur. And, again, right now, the reports are that negotiations, there has not been, to my knowledge, an official hire associated with this. Maybe it will be announced while we are talking. Again, right now, the reports are just that negotiations are going on. So let me give you a rundown of what I think about Kalen DeBoer with, as you all understand, a knowledge that this has not been officially announced, that there are just tons of reports that he is going to be the next coach, that negotiations are ensuing, that all of these things, people can change their mind. So if Kalen DeBoer is the hire, Mike Norvell said today, hey, I'm staying at Florida State. I'm going to get a $10 million deal. Steve Sarkisian put out, I'm sure, a massive raise to stay at Texas in some way. And Dan Lanning stayed at Oregon. Those were three guys reportedly that Alabama was interested in. Now, to be fair, what actually goes on, really only like Jimmy Sexton and Greg Byrne, the athletic director at Alabama, know. And there's always, much like in the NFL draft, you always notice in the NFL draft how everybody always gets the pick that they never expected would be there in the first round. In all of our mock drafts, this guy was never there. Every NFL team in the first round, that's what they say about their pick. They never expected him to be there. They're astounded that they get the value that they do. Anybody outside of like the top 2 or 3 picks, that's what they say for everyone. At coaching searches, no one ever rejects a job, right? I guarantee you Greg Byrne will come out if Kalen DeBoer is the hire, and he will say, we never offered the job to anyone else. Kalen DeBoer was our top choice from the moment Nick Saban announced he was going to leave. This was the guy I identified. No one else was ever targeted. There was never anybody else that could have ever taken this job. And that turns into kind of an interesting discussion of what is actually an offer. For college coaching search purposes, an offer does not occur until literally something is slid across the table and it is like a memorandum of understanding and you sign it. Until that point, no offer has occurred. The reality is we know how this happens, right? Agents back channel, have discussions, and they say, okay, what about 5 years, $50 million? What about this amount? All those other things. That's the way this actually takes place. So just file that away for purposes of your analysis. Here is what I would say my take is if Kalen DeBoer is the official hire of Alabama, leaving aside whether he was their top target or not, ultimately it doesn't matter. Remember, Pete Carroll was way down the list of potential candidates that USC could have hired, and he's one of the most successful coaches in the 21st century in college football. So sometimes you go down the list and you end up at a good spot. Here are the two things that will determine whether Kalen DeBoer is going to end up a successful coach at Alabama. He is very good with X's and O's, right? He has surrounded himself with a successful staff. I don't think there's anything you could point to and say, oh, this guy doesn't have the raw football knowledge or motivational tools to be a good coach. We know that's going to be true. Number one, how well is he going to recruit? Nick Saban was a maniacal recruiter. Kalen DeBoer has not recruited at an elite level at Washington. He just hasn't. This is why Dan Lanning would have been able to take that away. I like Dan Lanning personally as probably the best coach other than Lane Kiffin, who to me would have been a guaranteed home run hire. I would have had Lane Kiffin 1. I would have had Dan Lanning 2 on my list. So Kalen DeBoer is going to have to recruit at a really high level. And people out there say, well, it's Alabama. You don't have to work that hard. Yeah, you do. Okay? In order to get a top 5 recruiting class anywhere, you have to be a maniacal fiend on the recruiting trail. You have to identify top targets. You have to now manage NIL-related relationships, and I don't think Saban loved doing that. And you have to be willing to put together a staff that is fiendish on the recruiting trail, particularly in the South, where you know all of the top teams are going to be competing at an aggressive level. Now you have Texas and Oklahoma in the mix. Auburn's got Hugh Freeze, who's going to recruit well. Lane Kiffin's doing fabulous with the portal at Ole Miss. Again, recruiting. Washington didn't have a single 5-star player on their roster this year. Not one. I think Alabama had like 20, okay? You got to go get 5 stars. You got to lock and load them. Is Kalen DeBoer going to be an elite recruiter? Nick Saban had 10 number 1 recruiting classes. 10. okay? Is he going to be able to handle that recruiting? There isn't any evidence that he is right now. He's never done it. He has to be able to recruit at a top 5 level in order to win championships. That's number one. Second part of this, how's he going to fit in the culture of the South? So far, his coaching career, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Southern Illinois, Eastern Michigan, Fresno State, Indiana, Fresno State, Washington. Kalen DeBoer has never lived or coached in the South. Some of you out there are going to say, oh, that doesn't matter. I think it matters in a big way. The culture in the South is different. Kalen DeBoer could have a normal life in Seattle, Washington as the head coach of the Washington Huskies. Lots of people in Seattle had no idea who he was. He is now the president of the state of Alabama. Every meal that he has, every drink that he has, every public interaction that he has is going to be freighted because he is much a political figure now as he is a coach. He's going to have to kiss babies. He's going to have to pose for photos. This is a massive undertaking. Is he going to be able to handle the culture? I think one reason Brian Harsin didn't work at Auburn, big cultural challenge. Alabama hired Mike Price back in the day, Washington State. He wasn't prepared for the microscope that he was stepping into. I used Lane Kiffin as an example. Lane told me, going from USC to Tennessee, even having been the head coach of the Oakland Raiders, he had no idea the microscope that he was going to be under in Knoxville, how much people were going to care. The two things that are going to determine whether Kalen DeBoer succeeds, one, how he recruits, two, how does he do with the cultural shift. Now, he's coming into a talented team. We'll see. I would imagine most of the players will remain, although Isaiah Bond, who's a stud wide receiver, has entered the transfer portal. The first thing that Kalen DeBoer will have to do is recruit his existing players. The fact that Jalen Milroe is going to be there, the fact that much of the talent is going to return, he's walking into a top 5 job. I don't think you will see in year one an answer about how Kalen DeBoer will do. Recruiting and culture won't reveal itself immediately, okay? Remember, everybody thinks, oh, Alabama's a can't-miss job. Think about this for a minute now. Think about this. Alabama won one national championship from 1980 to 2008, 2009. Nearly 30 years, Alabama won one title trying to replace Bear Bryant. Maybe Kalen DeBoer steps in and immediately continues the success that Nick Saban had. I think that's highly unlikely. And the standard of expectation here is you make the playoffs every year. If Alabama doesn't make the playoffs this year, the long knives are going to come out. The expectations are high. Nick Saban has spoiled this fan base. Those are the things that I would think about. Now, from a Kalen DeBoer perspective, you're probably going to get $9 or $10 million a year. So if you get $9 or $10 million a year, what's the worst thing that can end up happening to you? It's not going to be a total disaster for you, and we'll see what happens. Also, how does the Washington staff take place? There's a really good rapport right now on the Washington staff. If they elevate from inside, then we will see what ends up happening. Report Washington has called a team meeting for 1:30. So we will see what happens and how this all shakes out. But that is the report now. Kalen DeBoer, unless something changes, as I am talking to you live at 3:17 Eastern, that is my analysis of the potential Kalen DeBoer hire.